event. I'm recording in progress. This is all about the next gen drought index platform, which we started to develop a few years ago. And I thought it would be interesting to give you an overview of how we deal with climate risk management and climate risk financing at the World Bank. Basically, my job is to translate different kinds of data into some kind of, we always call it actionable knowledge, but actionable knowledge means different things in different contexts. But once you've reached a level of where satellite data have been translated into some kind of actionable context and actionable knowledge, the question is, what is the actual action? And so in the case of the World Bank, that's of course in many cases related to some kind of financial instrument. So what I'll try to walk you through over the next 25, 30 minutes or so is this entire story between understanding a climate risk, in our case it's drought, in this specific use case, and how we deal with it from the perspective of translating data into something that our clients, different users, also many experts at the World Bank themselves can understand. So, intro. If you look at 100 climate-related disasters, there's a very good chance that between 20 and 50% are predictable. But then the pre-agreed finance component is related to 1, 2, 3% of them, right? So there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. I'll walk you through what exactly that means, and I'll walk you through how we are actually trying to enable pre-agreed financing using satellite-derived information at scale. Drought is and has been throughout my career particularly challenging. Not only because the terminology remains an issue, that people, if all of us look at a flood event, we would pretty much all agree that it is a flood or a tropical storm or any of the other climate hazards out there or weather phenomena. But for drought, that's a different story because it could be a dry spell. People could call it a heat wave. It could be related to desertification or aridity. So the terminology itself is challenging. A farmer that I met in Somalia a few years ago said, "Drought doesn't kill," and he's right. Like the drought itself doesn't kill. Drought leads to something, and that something causes socioeconomic problems. In the worst case, crop failure or socioeconomic impacts related to crop failure. And one of the most devastating impacts that humanitarians or governments need to deal with is large-scale food insecurity, of course, but there are many more root causes than just drought for food insecurity. So that's why I said complex causal relationships. If you have been following the global climate change agenda and the global climate change adaptation gap analysis, yeah, of course, very high numbers, right? So we talk about hundreds of billions in climate change adaptation financing gap per year. Even for drought, the latest UNCCD report estimated that annual losses already exceed 300 billion per year. Of course, a large percentage of these 300 billion is indirect costs. So directly, of course, the losses are often a lot lower. We often call drought a slow onset disaster. Climate change, global warming is changing all patterns, including the temporal characteristics of droughts. So flash droughts have become a thing. And that means despite the fact that the predictability is still given and still there at the sub-seasonal or seasonal scale, depending on where you are and depending on when the seasonal forecasts are issued. But flash droughts have become a thing, and that completely changes the game also from a financial risk management perspective. And whenever we develop any kind of climate risk finance tool, we need to first understand the history of the country. And understanding the history means more than just understanding hazard characteristics and just running the statistical analysis. It means understanding the links between hazards and impacts. And so for many low-income countries, quality control loss data, if it's agricultural or food insecurity or other socioeconomic impacts, in many cases, that's really hard. So what we also realized in recent years is that there's a huge gap in global disaster statistics. MDAT is one of the most frequently used data sets. You might like it or not, doesn't really make a difference. It's a fact that this is just a very a popular data set out there. And we realized that although we knew that there was a gap when it came to, for instance, human or economic losses related to climatological, meteorological, or hydrological events, droughts are clustered within the climatological um, category in the yellow bars. We were overwhelmed by the percentage of missing data. So we talk about more than 85% of data missing when it came to human losses in the 70s, but even now it's more than 70%. So that means that only 1 in 3 droughts that are recorded on the largest and I would say most complete disasters database, only 1 in 3 droughts has any information on human losses. The problem is not only that the data gaps are huge, the problem is that in many cases we don't know if a blank cell is a zero or an actual blank cell. And that itself is a challenge. So without disaster risk finance, and I'll explain in a second what we actually mean at the World Bank with disaster risk finance, particularly with pre-agreed disaster risk finance. There are a few options that you always have as an organization, as a government, or as another end user. Humanitarian relief is always out there. But in many cases, that leads to one specific scenario that is too little too late. And it's also uncertain, right? So if you rely on a CNN effect and you hope that major news outlets pick up your emergency, and then philanthropists will jump in and many individual donors will realize that there is a need in your region, and that will enable humanitarian assistance. That's risky, and everyone knows that. The second option for a government is emergency borrowing, right? That can have huge impacts on your government spending, on your fiscal policy, on your balance sheets. But in addition to that, it's not only stressful, it's slow and often uncertain. You can reallocate your budgets, right? You can use some national reserves and spend them on an emergency, or you can just ignore the emergency, which of course has devastating socioeconomic impacts, devastating long-lasting impacts on lives and livelihoods. And so what we try to focus on here at the bank is pre-agreed disaster risk finance. So it is funding that is pre-arranged, pre-agreed, and it's linked directly to a commonly accepted set of triggers. So for droughts, I'll walk you some of the triggers that we are using, but in many cases it's data sets that governments or insurers or reinsurers are comfortable with. That could be NDVI, that could be different NDVI versions or merged NDVI versions. But the most important thing is that it needs to be a rules-based pre-agreed approach. So it's exactly the opposite of uncoordinated emergency response. We need to understand what to do in which scenario. Ideally, if that all works out, and we've seen many success stories, of course, also many challenging situations, but ideally, that's a co-design process. So we work directly in collaboration with governments. It's in many cases a lot faster and cheaper than uncoordinated and slow emergency response. Um, but particularly if we talk about parametric insurance, that means spending money that you might not see again. Right? It's like a car insurance. There's not much difference in that sense. Um, so the question for us is always, how do we communicate the added value of such a financial instrument, and how is it actually embedded in the structures that are dominating the um, current decision-making processes. So if you want to compare the traditional indemnity-based to parametric insurance, it would be in the most super simplified, oversimplified version. It would be in the case of an indemnity insurance, it would be a policy and definition of losses and payouts. Shock causes losses. You assess your losses, and then there's a payout. It might take some time between the loss assessment and the payouts, but if this is a scenario where the insurance holder can economically survive the period between the loss assessment and the payout, that in many cases that works for farmers with hundreds or thousands of hectares. That's a very different story than if you are dealing with uh, 50, 100, 200,000 farmers with very, very small field sizes, because the loss assessment would be extremely expensive. And if the loss assessment becomes expensive, that means the entire insurance product becomes more expensive. So we try to turn that around. In parametric insurance, we say we also need to define our policies, but in addition to that, we need to define our triggers. Then when the shock happens, or actually before that, our index triggers, there's a payout, and we don't need any loss assessment. So that's the oversimplified version. In the ideal scenario, the parametric insurance really triggers much earlier than any kind of indemnity-based product that requires us to fully understand losses. In many cases for drought, we can trigger early in the season. If there's a delayed onset of the season, that in many cases already triggers a rainfall-based, soil moisture-based, evapotranspiration-based product, and then money is already transferred to governments, who can then start their early actions. This can work uh, for different groups. This can work directly with governments, directly with households, with farmers, herders, or with commercial entities. And I thought it would make sense to walk you quickly, before we talk about the actual EO component, uh, through the four core principles, because these core principles ultimately inform how our systems are actually structured. I'll do that very quickly. It won't be boring. First is the timeliness of funding. We know that speed matters, but not all resources are needed at once. We need more than one instrument to cover all potential risk characteristics. It's not only important where money comes from, but also how money reaches beneficiaries. And of course, it's all about translating data into some kind of actionable knowledge. Core principle one, timeliness of funding. Things become more expensive if you wait longer. That's basically the main story of this chart. We don't need all resources at once, but if we are very fast and we are confident that this particular drought can be captured early in the season, and it might lead to devastating impacts later in the season, then spending a little early in the season can have a huge return on investment, because it can mitigate socioeconomic impacts or agricultural impacts down the line. Insurance is a relatively expensive instrument. It's much more expensive than just using the reserves that a country already has available. So if a country wants to deal with high frequency disasters, something that happens every 2, 3, 4, 5 years, then the fiscal instruments reserves might be a better choice than spending money on premium payments for insurance. But then there's something between this high intensity, low frequency disasters, or low intensity, high frequency disasters. In many cases, that's some kind of contingent loan or contingent funding. And then you have the risk transfer instruments, which is mainly parametric insurance. Of course, it matters a lot if you use humanitarian channels to deliver assistance once the money has reached the government. Something needs to happen after that, right? So governments need to be aware where people in need are, where the beneficiaries are. In some cases, there are humanitarian pre-activation surveys where we actually know who's affected, to what degree, and where. A term that always comes up in the financial world when we use Earth observation data or any other climate data, model data, simulated data to develop a financial instrument is basis risk. And basis risk is basically the mismatch between what an insurance index indicates as a payout and the impact that is felt on the ground. There are many reasons why you could have basis risk. At the most basic level, that's related to data quality, but and that's the one that we talk about very frequently, but the others are not less important or less critical. So if your model is not working well, or if you have a drought risk finance product, but it's actually an armyworm infestation that destroys your crops, that's a problem, right? So that's from an agricultural perspective, that can be devastating, but it will not be covered by a drought risk finance product. In many cases, that's uh, related to a communication error. So we need to be very clear in the policies, in the mechanisms, what's actually covered and what happens if a certain trigger is reached. So the next gen platform. This platform was developed for one specific reason. The design, the validation, and evaluation of pretty much every parametric insurance index, particularly the ones for droughts, need to be more transparent, right? So things become an enigma very quickly because um, different people with different backgrounds are working together on the same instrument, but they might speak, they might use different jargon, they might have different priorities, um, they might have different mandates, they might follow a different modus operandi, and so our job is, when I said co-design, I really meant that. But co-designing complex tools is a lot easier said than done. It requires a lot of trust building. It requires a lot of capacity strengthening, and it requires it is um, the the farmer who really knows um, when the season actually starts. And in some cases, it might in one region it might always be on the 20th of May, and in other regions the season might start for farmers once the soils are wet enough so that their entire fist fits in the soil, right? So that's their indication. We've heard different stories. It's just super critical to understand the links between the satellite-derived hazard information and local vulnerabilities and people's actual coping capacities. Right? At the basis of our considerations when developing the next gen platform is that there needs to be a convergence of evidence approach, right? So whatever your background is, if you're a big fan of the SMAP soil moisture product or Lancet or Chirps or whatever is out there, VIRS and EVI, countless products, there is no perfect product, right? So um, in addition to people's or to the user's subjective perception of which data set is best or most suitable for their purpose, for their drought risk management in their country, it always makes sense to follow a convergence of evidence approach, relying on independent complementary observations. In the case of our platform, we started with CHIRPS satellite derived soil water index from European Commission, Copernicus, and VIRS NDVI backwards normalized with MODIS. There are many, many platforms out there that manage to pre-process satellite data, um, showing you spatially or temporally as time series anomalies. And I think in general, if it's done well, this can be very useful. Um, if there are too many platforms, also drought risk management platforms, then things become confusing. I won't tell you which country I'm referring to, but we've seen situations where a country in Latin America didn't have a drought monitoring system at all. They realized that, and now they have eight, I think. And of course, they use different methodologies, different data. Sometimes the model outputs or the satellite-derived anomalies are not agreeing with each other. If these nuances and the differences between different monitoring systems are not well communicated, that's a problem in itself. For us, it's of course important that uh, this is not a collab notebook. You don't need any coding skills. You can click around. You need to do some basic training. You ideally watch a 2-minute video and talk to us to be able to use the platform. But then you really have full control over all parameters. We're right now changing basic mechanisms. There are two development processes going on right now where we're we will soon make a difference between the basic user and the pro user, because it gets, if you're not familiar with the terminology, and you don't know the data sets, and you don't know the different development steps that are needed to translate a satellite data set into a simulated historical insurance payout, we really need to do everything we can to avoid confusion. Visualizations are generally generated on the fly, so the data are pre-processed, but it's really all about benchmarking. It's understanding if in this region, one satellite-derived product, one satellite-derived data set outperforms the other. And then the question is, of course, what does outperform mean? And usually in the sense of or from the perspective of disaster risk financing, the the definition of outperforming is related to hitting as many loss years as possible, right? So if I have an insurance index that runs on rainfall and it captures 5 out of the 7 worst drought years that we have observed in the last 20 or 30 years, and another product that just captures 3, then the one that captures 5 would outperform the other one. Um, it's important for us to give users the opportunity to, and the tool to compare drought conditions over space and time, but not only the drought conditions. By applying a relatively simple linear payout model, we can give users a very simple and quick tool to understand how, if this specific satellite-derived data set and these specific insurance parameters had been used, how the simulated payouts would have performed in their region at the subnational scale. And then, of course, it's all about validation, right? So if you want to develop a truly trustworthy product, then users need to have the option to look at everything, to modify everything, to download everything, and potentially also to compare the simulated payouts that they get through the platform with their own loss data that they don't want to share with us or anyone else. And so you start with satellite observations, you have this convergence of evidence, everything is available, you can run your quick spatial and temporal analysis because everything is pre-processed. That enables benchmarking, that enables the benchmarking of simulated historical payouts, all in a user interface that doesn't require coding. So usually it starts with selecting a target country, selecting your spatial aggregation, and selecting your critical window. A critical window is the one during which the satellite-derived anomalies are considered. Everything outside the window is considered irrelevant for index development. So at the most basic level, so that's the version that we're currently updating. You select your layers, you select your variables. You can select different climate variables. You can jump directly into the anomalies. You have your year slider at the bottom. It immediately shows you anomalies for the selected variable. Exactly. You can show data at the country level, which in most cases doesn't make much sense because you're averaging out all the wetness and dryness, and then it's the results is usually not very useful. But to compare countries over time, over large scales, or even regions, that can be useful in some cases. But usually we work at admin 1 or admin 2 level, or we work at an individual UAI level, which is the unit area of insurance. If, for instance, a user came up and said, well, I don't want to work at admin 2, I want to use my own newly delineated livelihood zones, then of course the index generation and the anomaly generation should adapt to your shapefile, should adapt to your boundaries and not just to admin 2. If you click on a region that shows you the anomalies for one or more variables, you can always change every variable in every parameter. When I say parameters, I usually mean the choice of the variable, the window, the periods, the risk coverage period, and the actual insurance parameter, which is when the index triggers and when it reaches its maximum. When the index triggers is called the actual trigger or attachment point, and the exit is usually defined as just like trigger as a return period. You could say I start my payouts with a drought that has a frequency of 1 in 5, a return period of 5 years, and my maximum is reached at 1 in 20 or 25. Then, of course, we walk people through different scenarios, ideally scenarios that they know very well, which enables them to activate different climate variables at the same time. So you could run this for rainfall. You could look at the admin2 anomalies of rainfall, soil moisture, and vegetation, and compare them. Right now, the platform is operational for the Horn of Africa. In January or February 26, it will be available globally as a global public good, so everyone can access it, and you will be able to upload your own data. So just to finish this one here, so you can always change everything, right? So you can always change the parameters, you can change the variable, you can change the region on a map, and everything updates dynamically. So in that case, we just clearly saw that the 3 variables indicated drought conditions in a region of Somalia that our regional teams knew well, and that gave the entire platform a lot of confidence that the selection of variables and parameters actually made sense in that case. You can visually compare precipitation, soil moisture, and vegetation anomaly, but most importantly, you can translate this into historical index insurance payouts. So you can, for instance, use all 3 variables and compare the historically simulated payouts in the region, or you can do the same thing, but just for one variable, in that case, NDVI, and compare it over different regions. So what we're currently working on is, of course, detrending, based on our knowledge that, of course, the past doesn't predict the future and that patterns are changing. This is just one example of a research study that we published last year in collaboration with folks from Columbia University. We just saw that there were different patterns affecting the 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 actual payouts and also simulated payouts in West Africa, so in the Western Sahel. And that was a problem because we saw that in general, if there's more dryness over the last 5, 10, 20 years, um, more dryness, less rainfall tends to increase the chances that you will have an insurance payout. But then if you look at the total rainfall amounts, that changed our perception again, because there was actually more rainfall after the 2000s than before. but it was distributed over fewer days, right? So if you have extreme rainfall events, that's not good for agriculture, particularly after the planting window. And so considering these climate shifts and trying to figure out what these climate trends actually mean, not in the big picture climate change story, but what they actually mean for insurance payouts for farmers or for governments. That's not only an exciting way of doing research, it's really relevant for us to keep that in mind. Because otherwise our payouts are off, and if the payouts are off, that means increased model uncertainty, and that means increased basis risk. So what are we working on right now? Um, there are two projects that are running in parallel. As I said earlier, it's all about scaling things up spatially. We're using more climate data. We're working with a National Drought Mitigation Center in Nebraska, who are generating a tailored composite drought indicator using four variables. For us, that's available globally. We will move from 1 to 2 insurance windows, simply because there was a request from several users who said, well, I think that my insurance window from mid-May to mid-June makes a lot of sense. And then I just try the second decade of June to the second decade of May to the second decade of June. And then in the next step, I've tried the third decade of May to the third decade of June. But it's very hard to compare them if you can't store any outputs, right? You could also, of course, always download them and then open your CSV file in a separate screen and then compare it this way. But it's a lot more straightforward if you have a direct visual comparison of your index performance using different windows in the same screen. We're trying to come up with a new vegetation monitoring product in a collaboration with the Global Development Assistance Initiative of the European Space Agency. One functionality that I consider very relevant, and the feedback from users was positive, but it's not straightforward because, of course, there are certain requirements for users to upload their own shapefiles so that the platform can start aggregating the different climate data for these particular unit areas of insurance. So there's a lot of quality control and a lot of mouse over information needed, so that we don't run into too many errors disrupting the user workflow. Yeah, detrending definitely plays a huge role, and getting our hands on advanced loss data. So whatever is out there, uh, working with governments or implementing partners of the governments that we're working in, um, that's critical. As soon as you manage to not only have the pre-processed satellite data in the platform, look at anomalies, compare them spatially and temporally, and translate them into historical payouts, but actually make sense of these payouts, to perform a basic sanity check if these payouts actually make sense if you compare them to historical loss data in the regions that you're actually focusing on. That's a game changer, and that definitely increases the usefulness of this type of platforms. I'm not saying that our approach is the only way to solve things. At the end of the day, I have absolutely no problem if anyone uses the platform, asks us uh, to better explain what's going on in the background, and decides to replicate this platform as a national next generation drought index platform for any country. So it's a global public good. You can do that. Um, yeah, another user request was that indices should be weighted, so that it's not only one or the other. In some cases, it might make sense to have one insurance window earlier in the season for rainfall and slightly shifted 1-2 decades later, another one for soil moisture, and then maybe a third window for comparison later in the season, focusing on vegetation health. And risk modeling plays a huge role. So basically trying to understand the scenarios that we haven't seen yet, looking at loss exceedance curves for different return periods that we don't have on record. So if we have 40 years on record and we've seen one or two really bad droughts, what would a devastating drought look like in the region? And what would this mean in socioeconomic terms? So we can not only prepare governments better for potential climate shocks, but also use these insights to optimize our internal risk modeling work, which ultimately feeds them back into the next gen platform. That's already my last slide. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out anytime. We will soon update the platform again. So right now I don't think it's working because people are actively working on it. But in the coming weeks, there will be an update, and you'll be free to play around with it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcus. That was great. Thank you so much. I was like, I tried to I was like a tourist trying to understand the system, and always coming to like, oh, why you do this way? And and that was very interesting. We open the floor for the questions. Um, oh, Molly, you have the advantage of being panelist.
Yes, thank you so much,
Emily.
Marcus. Super interesting. One of the things Marcus and I and another colleague wrote a paper together earlier this year that will hopefully soon come out in the proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. That paper pointed out the lag between the rainfall, the soil moisture, and the vegetation. So that lag, as you say, can be leveraged, but I think that there are a lot of different kinds of uncertainties and a lot of challenges. For example, vegetation, right? You can't see plants that are this big from space very well, right? It's really hard because it's like 95% soil, 5% plant. And then if it rains on that, then you get a much bigger soil moisture related decline in the vegetation because it's darker than it was. However, the plants might be getting bigger. So you have all these competing errors and corrections. And how does your system deal with that sort of offset or change and the uncertainty, which is just inherent in this kind of system? How do you show
So
that uncertainty? Yeah.
yeah. So it's quite fascinating that when people start correlating different kinds of climate data and NDVI with agricultural losses, and they do that with early season estimates, they're surprised that it doesn't really work well for NDVI. So yeah, so we've seen that many times. There are many operational drought risk finance systems that rely on NDVI, and that they just wait until the season is over. To be honest, if this is a system that works for you, and you can minimize the time between the NDVI processing and quality control is completed, and the actual payout to the government, and if that takes a month or so, that's fantastic. But then that still means we need to wait until the end of the season. Then NDVI processing starts, anomalies are calculated, the index is calculated. That's very fast, this process. What takes longer is then usually the payout and the distribution and the actual translation of payouts into something meaningful for people that are affected. What we are trying to establish is, and that's why also this new two-window system was developed, there is a predictive skill of rainfall when it comes to NDVI anomalies, and there's a predictive skill in soil moisture. And so we developed machine learning models that work pretty well for 30 to 60 days, predicting NDVI anomalies at a pretty decent skill. Whatever I can do to sort of create a system that triggers as early as possible in the season before any drought impacts are visible, while at the same time making sure that clients are comfortable with triggering early in the season. That's what we want to have. And if you can, then you could even trigger early in the season and then validate with NDVI later in the season. That's also fine. But at the end of the day, it just needs to be something that people understand.
Right. So it's an educational process. Please,
Absolutely.
sir, consider these other variables which do a better job capturing the little tiny itty bitty baby plants, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly. So it's brilliant. I love it.
I think there was.
Yes, it's there's a long question. I don't know if Elda want to speak. Maybe you can, or maybe you can read the question, Marcus. Good luck.
Yeah. So right now, Drought monitoring
I can,
yeah, yeah. Okay. Okay.
yeah.
I read it. Very
And
quickly. Um, how it's different from the US drought monitor. It's very different in a way that the US drought monitor does not simulate payouts. And this is primarily focusing on the financial aspect of things, right? So if you look at the if you were to include the composite drought indicator, which is used in the US drought monitor, in our platform and roll it out globally, this element would be very similar. We're not exactly using the CDI that is used for the US drought monitor, but it's kind of similar. So this element would be similar. Our focus is not only the drought monitoring part. I would say we really emphasize the link to financial instruments. It's really about designing, validating, calibrating a financial instrument that enables you to develop and roll out and operationalize a parametric insurance product that works at the sovereign level or even at the regional level. So it closes the gap between the drought monitoring and the financial aspect through the simulation of historical payouts based on the data and the parameters that you chose in the platform that I just showed you. From a drought forecasting perspective, right now, this is exclusively focusing on the monitoring aspect, and that has many different reasons. You could understand anticipatory humanitarian action as pre-agreed finance as well, right? For the difference between anticipatory action and disaster risk finance is not only the mechanisms, it is also not only the data, because anticipatory action relies on forecasts. For drought, it relies on seasonal forecasts, and we don't. But the biggest difference is the scale, right? World Bank operations and parametric insurance products can have a much higher budget associated with it. When you talk about anticipatory action, some cases that's a few $100,000, a few million. In the case of parametric insurance, that is often a much larger budget. And if there's a larger budget, most users are hesitant to release these large budgets, these large fundings through a system that is associated with more uncertainty than our monitoring data. And seasonal forecasts are inherently more uncertain. At the same time, the return on investment, if it actually works, is a lot higher, right? So if the season starts in May, you can already trigger in February. You might need a lot less funding to come up with the same mitigation measures, but you would have to convince a client that they really need to trust a seasonal forecasting model, which means trusting ensemble predictions, which means communicating uncertainties, which means understanding sensitivities. The story is complicated enough with a monitoring system. It becomes a lot more complicated and a lot more uncertain if you look at forecasting data. I'm very happy. Keep in mind, even though we're not focusing and we're not using seasonal predictions, parametric insurance triggers independently from losses. It triggers independently from drought impacts, right? So if I manage to develop a system in direct collaboration with a client in a low-income country that is robust enough that everyone trusts, and we figure out how to write a policy for a product that triggers early in the season before drought manages to have any socioeconomic impacts, simply because the start of the season was delayed, and that leads to a payout. That's a clear win for me. If you want to then add your own layer, focusing on drought forecasting products to that, you're absolutely I have no problem with that. But linking a large scale insurance payouts to that, I think this will. I'm not saying this will never be possible because there are already pilots for a forecast-based insurance with the World Food Program. But at the current stage, I would be more comfortable like properly calibrating and validating the system the way we have it right now than to not complete this and jump into seasonal prediction.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you. And then the another one is the insurance premiums. Generally, agriculture, since it's quite uncertain because there's drought, there's flood, there's locusts, a lot of things, and so that means the premium payout will be expensive because the probability of failure could be high. And so in regions, especially where there is frequency of drought is increasing due to climate change, how is this affordable?
So that leads us back to two topics. In many cases, there are premium subsidies, right? So the poorest countries often don't pay the premiums themselves or only pay a share of premiums themselves. I know from different, even small island states where over the last years, there was the subsidies were dramatically reduced because they saw the added value of insurance and said, we want insurance to protect our people. And we don't talk about billions, right? So in the case of small islands, we talk about millions in premium payments. That's one story. And the other story is about the risk layering. So the definition of an extreme drought is that it does not happen frequently, because if it happens frequently, it's not an extreme drought, right? Like from a statistical point of view, if you have a drought frequency that reaches a level of that reaches a frequency that is just too high for parametric insurance, then maybe parametric insurance is not the right tool, right? If the frequency of a drought shock happens every 3 years on average, then other tools might be more affordable, then other tools might be more suitable, or they could be combined with parametric insurance so that you have one layer to cover the more frequent events that are usually less severe, and the more extreme events for which you can afford a higher premium payment because you can expect higher damages and you will need more money to mitigate these damages. So it's all about combining different tools in the environment of one holistic disaster risk management and finance platform, and that requires just so many players on board. And that's why I keep saying it's all about co-design and all about strengthening capacities. And that only works if we really have a trust-based relationship where different tools can be combined. There's no one-fits-all approach, never.
Yeah.
Thank
you. And one more,
Sure.
let me just
Go-
wrap it up. So has there been, so the payouts is generally in cash, that means, I guess?
Yes.
Yes. So has there been in kind, for example, like irrigation infrastructure, like pumps, or so that they can utilize the nearby stream, or maybe there's usually projects end up being less maintained, and so, for example, the canal silt has built up in the small dam, and
Yeah, yeah.
so it's not something like
Very,
that. Has there been in
very,
kind?
very quick answer.
Yeah.
Anything is possible,
Okay.
but our role as the World Bank is not to tell governments what to do. Our role at the World Bank and our mandate is to support governments. We provide technical assistance. Anything is possible after an insurance payout has been made to the government, right? So whatever they do, often that is done in collaboration with us and using our technical assistance. Whatever they do is it can even be related to infrastructure investments, drip irrigation, whatever, but that would then not be an emergency measure, right? That's more like a development challenge to reduce the overall vulnerability or
Drought
increase
impact.
the regional resilience. So governments are completely free to do that, but of course, it needs to be a structured approach. So you can't, once you have received your insurance payout, you can go completely crazy and do whatever you like.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Sure.
Markus and Elda, and that's create a great transition for our next topic. That